at Gaza, and then they started their missile attacks. And then they would cry to the United Nations when Israel hit them back. Too few Jews have died, they say. There's gotta be something wrong. Israel must be cheating somehow. It's not fair that they're so strong. When someone comes and kills you in the middle of the night, don't try to defend yourself, don't lose an ounce of might. Just sit there quietly and try hard not to think. As the world calls out for maximum restraint. Maximum restraint. Maximum restraint. Maximum restraint.
Our next speaker is Professor Joseph D. Ben-Dek. He is a sought-after advisor on terrorism, culture, and evolving technologies to the leaders of both Israel and the USA. He has spent 7 years as an Assistant Secretary General of the UN, Science and Technology. He has held professorships at several world universities, including those of Israel, USA, New Guinea, Mongolia, and Korea. He was awarded 2 PhDs from University of Michigan, specializing in methods, research, sociology, and conflict resolution. Dr. Ben-Dek is highly conversant in Hebrew, Arabic, English, Polish, and several other languages. His current positions include Chairman and CTO, Knowledge and Planning Corp, Vice Chairman and CSO, Advanced Reconnaissance Corp, and Chairman, Aeronautica Alliance. Professor Ben-Dek is an Israeli citizen who arrived in New York just this past weekend.
Thank you. Well, I have to say I'm extremely excited. I'm normally not getting excited when I make public speeches. But this is a kind of a touching event, and when I consider that in light of the movie we just saw, the last thing I've done in Israel before I came here, which was Friday, was a meeting of a special group that was looking at the cases that we will have to present in case there is an international investigation of the Gaza situation, especially in terms of hitting civil population in Gaza. And what struck me, to be honest, because I was not part of the original team that was planning the whole thing, was the careful attempt to document every single case in which Israel used firepower against areas where civil population in Gaza was there, with the idea of using the term of restraint to the extreme meaning of the term. The documentation was approximately 10,000 pages long, and the video, if you had to show it in the long term, would be about a month, literally. I made the point during the meeting that I think we should make it public. As public as possible and as early as possible. Like everything else in Israel, many people, of course, disagreed, and for the time being, it's being debated. But the reason I bring it up is because there are some things that cannot be debated, and I want to start by saying something about it so that at least all the facts will be clear. We live in a very ugly world. The situation we are involved in the Middle East, Israel, is not so particular to Israel, as you can see every single day when you watch television. For example, take the cases of the Yazidis in Iraq, in the Kurdish elements. They are altogether Christians as well as Muslim Kurds. They are being persecuted now for a lot of time. And the massacre that was going on over the past 3.5 months, not the last months when the American media found it out, or the European media, was expected for the past, I would say easily 10 years. Because the whole thing about Daesh that exists there is not a new phenomenon. And my point, the first point I want to make, and I have to make it, to make sure that we are on the same ground in terms of the basic facts, because the media is one hell of ignorant people teaching total nonsense to people that are listening to them so willingly and so enthusiastically. It gets me out of my mind. When you take the issue of facts into consideration, you begin to see things which are very obvious. I'll give you the basic analysis I have for this in a very simple term. It's not that complicated. When you take the Daesh, you take Al-Qaeda, you take Hamas, and you take about 12 other organizations which are less known, and you look at their ideology, you can summarize their ideology in 3 terms. A, Islam is the only religion that makes sense. Christianity, Judaism are basic religions that are delayed or have had their time, and they are no longer relevant. And their believers are non-believers, essentially should be exterminated or treated as inferior, number one. Number two, in the sense of the regime that the world should have, they believe in the Caliphate, that is to say, a system in which Islam and Sharia law are the only ways to live. You cannot assume that in any situation where you think that democracy is a value, because Sharia is not assuming democracy is a legitimate value. And 3, when it comes to a moderate relationship, this is the most hurting thing of all to me. People talk to me often about moderate Islam. The reality is that people that are moderate Muslims today are moderate particularly because they themselves have moderation, or they themselves are kind of low-key people, or they have some sort of an inclination to become human. But the religion as such as it is today is a religion that has had a very clear value. In one sense, this is Allah is not to be understood by the principles of equality or love or understanding. It's a statement that comes from the Quran, has gone through very minimal interpretation, and I'll talk about it in a second. And the end result of all of that is that us, people like us, and other people that are not Muslims are to be inferior and so treated. Moderate Islam, therefore, or moderate Muslims are the exception, and they would be treated as marginal. The reason I emphasize this point so much is because the situation is not so bleak. I belong to a group of about 90 scholars, many of them are Muslims, that are beginning to take a second look at the Islam and what kind of manipulation was done with Islam over the past century. I'm sorry, a millennium. The difference is only 1 0. You would want to say 100 years because you really think in terms of theology being such an intensive experience in Judaism and Christianity, or for that matter even Buddhism. But in Islam, the reality is that no major change and no major serious work, intensive work was done to moderate, to get into the modern times over more than 1,000 years. Now is probably some time to come. Now the reason I mentioned that is not because I want you to understand that next week Muslims are going to be all better and our life will be much more easier. On the contrary, in the next several years it's going to be much more terrifying, because the debate between Islam of the sort I'm talking about and the traditional Islam is going to be very tough. we are not going to be the only subject. The subject is also other Muslims, which have a very hard time in that. But having said that, I want to come back to our major subject here. The reason why I generate the kind of the similarity between all of these Muslim groups and the fact that they hate so many other people except us, it's very important to bear in mind as a major point to start to explain to anybody who is reasonable where we are all about, or where we are going to. Because the emphasis on Israel per se, while it's very important, very critical, has to be something in line with the fact that we are talking about humanity that ought to have higher standards for everybody, and the Jews are only one part of that issue. Unfortunately, we are the focus of everything to go. Just before I left Israel, I got a note from the president of the British Union of Students that basically, I'm sure that's not connected to that. He was saying basically that they decided to apply the principle of the BSD to Israel and Israeli students and Israeli academia. So I asked him, why are you telling me that? He said, because we just decided it. He said, but I cannot do anything about it now because you have already decided. He basically kind of apologized back and forth, but the reality is that we're going to face a lot of that stuff. And that brings me to the second major point, other than Islam. People like easy solutions, and everything just to do with Jews complicates their life. It's true for Jews too. But the issue I find a lot when I talk to media, I'll give you one or two examples very quickly. The most interesting aspect that I learned when I met journalists, media people who came from very different journals and television in Tel Aviv over the past week when they came back from Gaza, and they told me what they saw, which they documents in minute detail the fact that all the attacks on Israel came from